All right, so we are back with your second screencast in your revision process. This one is all about your exposition and your rising action. This is, of course, where things really get interesting. Now that you've hooked your reader in with your awesome new narrative hook, you are going to set them up in the exposition and take them on your ride just before the climax in your rising action. So to start, your exposition, this is what's just beyond your narrative hook. In your exposition, you want to introduce your setting, your background, your main characters, and kind of the basic situation and conflict. Of course, you've probably already hinted at some of these things or even straight up given them in your narrative hook, which is fantastic. You'll see there might be some blending of your narrative hook and the information that you need to have in your exposition. So, what do you need to include in your exposition? Technically, your narrative hook belongs in your exposition, but it's so important, so I made a separate screencast for it. You need to talk a bit about your setting. You need to introduce your major characters, your protagonist, antagonist, and any other characters that are important. I would really urge you to keep your characters to a minimum. You're only working within 2 to 4 pages. I would say 3, 4, maybe 5. That's getting up there, characters. Because otherwise you have to build all these characters, characterize them, and within 2 to 4 pages, that's a lot of work to do. You also need to, in your exposition, introduce your problem and your conflict. This should be crystal clear within the first paragraphs of your short story. You don't have time to set a bunch of backstory. So it's really important, you guys, to set that up right away. And then any other background information necessary to move the plot forward. And when I say necessary, you have to really think long and hard. Is this information truly necessary to my conflict, moving my plot forward, and what's going to come of it in the climax and the resolution? If not, you're going to have to make some tough decisions and get rid of some stuff. That's the way writing works. You write something, you can never get too attached to it because it might need to change or go away later. All right, so step 1. Now, when I say step 1, this doesn't necessarily mean this needs to be the first thing in your exposition, but this is the first thing I'm going to talk about. You need to introduce your protagonist. It's likely that your protagonist will also be in your narrative hook, but you're going to need to tell more about them in your exposition. So some things to include about your protagonist, and just a word of caution here, you don't have to include all of this. Include information that's important to the story and the conflict as well as the resolution. Don't include a bunch of crazy background information about where they were born and what their parents did and how old they were when they first rode their bike if it's not necessary to the story. Okay? So, things such as age, physical description, anything that's special about them. Do they have a scar? Do they have a limp? Do they have a birthmark? Anything special about them that kind of pertains to the story or will help with characterization? Tell us why they do things the way they do? Great, include it. Do they have a job? Are they a student? Are they an ad executive? Are they a surgeon? And again, tell us this information, especially if it's really important to the plot. What kind of character do they have? Are they a good person? Are they patient and kind? Or are they hot-tempered and rude? Remember, especially here, to show rather than tell. Instead of saying, Johnny was really rude, show us that Johnny was really rude. In his actions, Johnny slammed down the dollar on the counter after the cashier demanded that he not take any more pennies out of the penny jar. Stuff like that. You have to tell us what the problem or the conflict is. Show it to us. That's a great thing to do in the narrative hook, and then it's already set in motion. You also need to talk about your antagonist. What's your protagonist's relationship to the antagonist? And then brief background information that's critical to the plot. Don't include information that's not related to your plot, especially in a short story. You don't have time for it. Don't bother with it. Step 2, set up your setting. What's the setting of your story? Is it in the hot, steamy jungle of Belize? Is it the International Space Station, or is it in the hallways of your new middle school? No matter what your setting is, you have to leave us with a sense of place. Like, is it an exciting place to be? Is it unbearable and hot? Is it unwelcoming and bland? What is it? You have to give that to us in your setting. Make sure you show your reader about your setting. Don't just tell us about it. So here's a great example. In blue here, we have someone telling. In red, it's showing. So in blue, Misty went to school at the brand new building at the district. Everything was new and nice, and all the students had laptops, rich parents, and bratty attitudes. That's just all telling, right? It's pretty boring. Isn't this a lot more interesting? Misty approached the imposing front steps of Lincoln Middle School. Everything about the building was fresh, clean, and seemingly unused. Inside, every student wore expensive shoes, from Nikes to Uggs, and carried fancy and trendy laptop bags strapped to their backs. She sighed and pushed open the doors, only to be jostled aside and shot dirty looks at her hand-me-down backpack and dirty, old, and too small shoes. Fits right in, gives us the setting, also gives us some information about the protagonist's attitude about the setting, and potentially maybe hints at some conflict to come. So not only are we introducing setting, we're doing a couple of the other really necessary pieces in the exposition as well. Step 3, conflict. Give us that conflict right away. Your exposition needs to include a very clear-cut conflict, just one. You might have kind of a sub-conflict, but given that this is a short story, you should only have one main conflict. So, type. What is it? Is it person versus person? Is it person versus nature? You don't need to tell us that, but you need to show us that. It should be clear to your reader what type of conflict it is. You should include in your exposition continuous tension built up around your conflict. Needs to be introduced pretty soon in the exposition. It's best if you can really get it into the narrative hook. So, for example, in the book Forgotten, LJ, the author quickly introduces the main character, Luis. Notice how he very subtly introduces the conflict right in the first paragraph. So this is a great example of narrative hook combined with conflict. When he left without saying goodbye, or at least not in the manner he should have. If he knew that he would have been gone for such a long time, he would have done more to say goodbye. So the readers can tell right away that the conflict is internal. It's internal because this main character, Luis, didn't say goodbye in the right way and is really left the person described here feeling empty and feeling, like he's missing something. So it's clearly an internal conflict. All right, so after you have gotten your exposition down, you've introduced your setting, your plot, your main characters, you need to jump right into the rising action because, again, short story, you need to jump right into it. So the rising action, of course, is the part of the story where you begin to develop your conflicts. So you've introduced the conflict in the exposition. Now you're starting to make those conflicts more interesting in your rising action. Of course, building to the climax. So your rising action, you need to move your plot forward toward the climax. If you have things going on in your rising action that is not part of building to the climax, you need to get it on out of there because there's just not time. There's no room for it. Don't include details that don't matter to the overall plot or conflict. You'll also kind of further develop the characters in the relationship, so how they act toward each other, what they say and do with one another. You'll be able to show more of that character relationship. But again, the more characters you have, the more difficult this is going to be. So again, I urge you to maybe only have 2 or 3 characters that you're really talking about within your short story. Every action of your character should directly relate to the conflict somehow and be leading toward the climax. So there should be a plan to solve the conflict. They should be preparing for the climax or first somehow fixing the problem. And it should become increasingly, as you move forward, more tension-filled. So it should be building like a roller coaster. Think of going up, 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 and you're anticipating the climax and that high point. A little bit more about rising action. You need to ask yourself, does what I have in my rising action help move my protagonist towards solving their conflict? If your answer is, I don't know, or not really, you need to take it out of your story. It's painful to remove parts of something you've written, but it's in the best interest of your story and your reader and ultimately, excuse me, your grade. So your characters, especially your protagonists, need to be round, as in they need to change. They need to go from being one way in the exposition to somehow being changed in your resolution. For instance, your protagonist might be introduced as an exposition shy and nerdy and kind of a loner. He or she might have to join the drama club in order to help solve their conflict or solve a mystery or something. So that really forces them to change or to be in an uncomfortable situation. Makes it a lot more interesting to read. Now, a little bit before I will leave you here to go and do some work on your rising action, don't forget to show. Of course, do more showing than telling. So instead of saying he's angry, say he's sitting at his desk, his jaw tightened, and his eyes flashed heat waves at me. Much better. Much more interesting. So by showing or evoking, meaning to bring about, you are making the reader feel. You're evoking emotion in the reader. You aren't just informing him. If you're just informing someone, it's not very interesting. It's kind of flat and boring. So you want to show and evoke emotion. That's what literature and writing is all about, is getting people to feel something with you. So here's some examples, some sort of telling versus showing examples. So the temperature had fallen overnight, and the heavy frost reflected the sun's rays brightly. Like, it's nice, it's okay, but mostly it's telling what's happening. Try and make your reader feel or evoke some kind of emotion. So here's the same idea with showing instead. The morning air was bitter ice in her nose and mouth, and dazzling frost lay on every bud and branch. Much more interesting. Makes you feel like you're there. Also involves the character. Next one. Just telling. The taller man was a carpenter, complete with the tools of his trade. Kind of like two-dimensional, just like you can like see this sort of flat picture of a guy with a tool belt on. Versus, a saw and hammer dangled from his belt, and an adze was hooked to it. One thumbnail was black, and when he bowed, she saw several long wood shavings caught in his curly hair. Much more thought-provoking, right? How about this one? They stood close and wrapped their arms around each other in a passionate embrace, so that she became aware that he had been riding, and then that he was as nervous as she was. So how about this? They gripped each other, and the tweed of his jacket was rough under her cheek. His hand came up to stroke her hair. She smelled leather and horses on the skin of his wrist. He was trembling. So the first one is really flat. You're almost like she could tell he had been riding. Like, what are you even talking about? Versus the second one, it really describes the smell of the leather and what a horse might smell like, or someone might smell like after riding horses all day long, right? Much more evocative, much more feeling. So, just like in the last screencast, now what? Now it's time to make some revisions to your story's exposition and rising action. Don't be afraid to make changes. So William Faulkner, one of the greatest American writers of all time, once said that in writing, you must kill all your darlings. And what he's referring to there is like the idea that you can write something, but then you have to change it. You have to cut it. You have to make revisions. You have to change it. Rarely does something come out perfect the first time. It needs lots of work and change. Your final draft is going to look very different from your rough draft, I suspect. But the idea that you are putting in the hard work and the thought behind it is huge, and that's going to make your final draft much better. You need to remember that this is all about making the story the best for your reader, not for you. So, and ultimately that's something that you should be really proud of, is that you've written something that people want to read and find interesting. So, now, go forth and make your revisions to your exposition and your rising action. Good luck!